It is a saying that comes from the revolutionaries at the National Union of the Homeless. It is a saying that says, we only get what we are organized to take. When we look back in history at all the gains that the working class has made, it has taken the unity and collective power of workers to win those gains. Things that seem normal to us today, like unemployment insurance, Social Security, it took the organization and sacrifices of working class people to win. Now, today, the crisis that the poor face continues to intensify. We must ask ourselves, what are the needs of the 140 million poor people in this country? How do we have increasing amounts of poverty, unimaginable levels of poverty for the masses, while the wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few? How do we stay connected to the people to make sure that the politics that we are engaging in are the politics of the masses, the millions, not just for the few? And so I'm going to be posing several questions to the folks that are on this panel, folks that are connected to struggles at the border, struggles with housing and with tenant organizing, and struggles of low income and poor communities. So the first question I'm going to ask is directed to Carlos. And Carlos, feel free to introduce yourself. When we talk about immigrant rights, we often fail to understand what is happening at the southern border, particularly to migrants and agricultural workers. Could you share with us the challenges that agricultural workers and border communities are facing and what organizing in these communities looks like?
Thank you, David. And I'm glad and honored to be part of this webinar with my sister and brother, who I admire and respect a lot. Good evening to all participants. This is a very important conversation about the state of the United States today, after 100 years of the Biden administration, and in an analysis of where we go from here. I sincerely thank the People's Forum for the invitation to speak on behalf of the border agricultural workers based in El Paso, Texas, on the US-Mexico border. From where I'm sitting now, if I look south through my window, I see the landscape of Ciudad Juarez. So we are really in the border. And let me start by saying something that has been clear during this 1.5 years of terrible times for all of us, for everybody across the United States, but especially for the most marginalized people in this country. Is the case of the farm workers that I work with, the immigrants, and especially of the single mothers who are part of the farm labor force and who run the families, immigrant families. Something that we have learned during this 1.5 years of pandemic crisis is that, and I explain why we say that, is that if something we have learned during this 1.5 years is that this capitalistic system, this capitalism has taught us during this time, difficult times, times of suffering, of destruction, of death, that this is truly a system of destruction and death. And therefore the importance of, of the title of this webinar, Where to Go, Reform or Revolution. So in the case of our border region, the strategy of war to contain migration continues. This strategy includes the militarization of the border, the separation of our border communities, the persecution and deportation of refugees immigrants, and children. Today, the Secretary of National Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, declared that the removals of immigrants will remain in place. When they say removal, actually is what we call deportations. That they will remain in place until the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommends lifting the rule imposed to prevent the spread of the pandemic under Title 42. The Title 42 is a provision issued by CDC on March 2020 during the Trump despotic administration. And the current administration of Joe Biden has continued to keep in force. The arrival of immigrants, just to give you an idea, last month of April were more than 178,000 apprehensions by the Border Patrol, 3% more than the month of March. And such number, once again, exceeds the records for the past 20 years. The majority of the apprehended are adults that United States expels, deports without the right of asylum, to apply for asylum. Across the river, across from the border, the streets of Ciudad Juarez are full of refugees, mainly from Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, who ask for alms and shelter in order to survive and wait for an opportunity to try to enter United States. And here, it's very important that we understand that this environment of violence or militarization of the border and of the deployment of the National Guard by the President of Mexico to do the dirty work of the North American government of containing and repressing migration, that the struggle of organization and the border agriculture workers, takes place. Of course, we must add that the pandemic has disproportionately affected agricultural workers and mainly working women, that has actually made people focus on surviving, on getting a life of this with their impoverished families. So it's under this terrible situation that our struggle is taking place. One, to survive, and something very important to make people understand that even before the pandemic, the situation was already bad. Farm workers, for example, in the United States, do not have collective bargaining rights. Therefore, they are unable to organize and to create the political collective force they need in order to pressure for changes to the reality of oppression. So we firmly believe that is the time that we put into the political agenda of this current crisis the elements that we can develop together, because not a single organization can do the fight against this system and to survive this crisis alone. It takes more than one organization. It takes an alliance of different groups, understanding that we need to change the reality of oppression and exploitation. And for us, the most important part is to continue our organizing efforts, but now we need to develop some different creative ways of doing it, because we cannot go back to the same way that we have been organizing before in order to confront this terrible system that only creates oppression, exclusion. I will start with that.
Thank you so much, Carlos. So Leo, you're an organizer with the LA Tenants Union and Unión de Vecinos. You've been working with communities who are facing the hardest of times because of struggles around housing and shelter. Could you talk to us a bit about what the programs of survival that tenants and the houseless have led during the pandemic, and how it has led to the increased organization, what it looks like?
I was in mute, sorry. Yeah, I think it's important for starters to understand who's Unión de Vecinos. We're a community organization in East Los Angeles in Boyle Heights, a very small community when you look at the scale of Los Angeles, but we've been doing a lot of organizing and a lot of fight against gentrification. Gentrification that has occurred since 1996 under Clinton and before, and that we've been fighting even during the period of Obama and then more recently under Trump. And we're talking about the displacement of the poor for profit, basically. And our struggle within the community has been a struggle that's been well documented in the media and in some levels, especially with our fight against the galleries. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that you cannot change the world by just saving your neighborhood. We need to grow and we need to expand. And that's why we formed the Los Angeles Tenants Union. Los Angeles Tenants Union is an autonomous organization of tenants that is led by tenants and declares its autonomy from the nonprofit foundations and political sectors because in a lot of cases, organizations have chosen to negotiate their defeat as changes are happening in the community. So when we talked about the 100 days of Biden, when we talk about the change, our lens looks way farther into the past and farther into the future. We cannot measure change just basically in these 100 days. We may want to ask the same question that Ronald Reagan asked in 1980, right before in his last debate, which is very strange that I asked that question, but that's the question that he asked. Are we better off today? Are we able to buy the things that we need? Are we able to get the jobs that we need? Is America respected? And the reality of the times is that none of that has changed. Ronald Reagan and his neoliberalism didn't change anything. So if we ask about what are we supposed to do in these 100 days, well, the answer is we need to keep fighting. And for the tenants in Boyle Heights and in our communities, the response under the pandemic has been a very radical response because when the pandemic started and the businesses shut down and jobs shut down and people's hours got reduced, people didn't have the means to pay for the rent. People didn't have the means to buy for food. People didn't have the means to do anything that was like their everyday life or their work would allow for them because they got a minimum wage that is not enough for them to survive. That is not enough for them to have a regular life. So we launched what we call the rent strike. Basically, tenants in their buildings organized to say, we're not going to pay the rent because we cannot pay the rent. We're not going to buy the rent because we need to buy food and we need to do some things that are more important than paying the rent. There was a moratorium of rent and evictions that allowed and helped for this situation. But the idea of being in debt and keeping the debt wasn't enough. We had to change our consciousness about what it meant to not to pay rent and to decide not to pay rent. What it meant to get over the fear of not being able to pay the rent. So tenants organized within their neighborhoods, within their buildings, not to pay their rent, and organize themselves to be able to support each other, which took us to another level of organization, which was what we call the mutual aid. Across the communities, within the neighborhoods, people brought together their resources and got resources from other places to be able to distribute food to each other, to collect and distribute food to each other, and also to collect and take care of, bring medicines together to help for each other. So the pandemic has created a web within the communities of people and places where people can go to get help for food, get help for health, and get all sorts of information. The pandemic has created a situation where the house is become very visible as a place where you do education, you do your education, healthcare, and other kinds of resources. The education has become very visible as a place for the community to organize and reproduce itself. So mutual aid and in the community across our own buildings has been very, very important. But of course, if you declare a rent strike and you decide that you're not going to pay the rent, then of course landlords are going to be very frustrated and very, very scared, which meant that for a long time, and still today, we have a lot of illegal, abusive evictions or threats of eviction. There's a lot of harassment of tenants. There's a lot of threats, and there's a lot of abuse that is going on. So we created the Rapid Response Network, which is different groups of people within different neighborhoods, with the different locals of the tenants union that are organized to defend tenants against their evictions. Whenever the police comes to enforce an illegal eviction, these groups of people have come and blocked that eviction and kept people in their homes. Whenever a landlord is abusive or is threatening people with racist statements and all sorts of situations, these groups of people are showing up and talking to the landlord and convincing him or her that it's better to leave the tenant alone, or instead of having a picket in front of their building, and so on and so forth. So we've developed a different kind of militancy and a different kind of organizing at the local level, at the neighborhood level. But as I said before, it's not enough to defend your block. You need to defend the city, and it's not enough to defend your city. You need to defend the city, the country. So these networks and these communities are developing a different way of fighting and a different way of understanding what is their fight. So I can start with that situation so we get a sense of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Leo. That is very inspiring, and that we're going to need that level of organization and militancy to in preparation for if there are mass evictions. Tishali, for the past few years, there has been a growing movement and awareness of key issues that the poor in the US are facing. The water struggles in Flint, Michigan, Lowndes County, Alabama, the fight for Medicaid and Medicare, the fight for welfare rights and jobs. What are some of the reforms that have been proposed in apparent response to these mass movements?
Well, it's a good question. And I actually wanted to go back for a minute, David, when we started this conversation, you said that, you know, there were 140 million people in the country who were poor, or how we say, one emergency away from being poor. And millions of people found themselves or ourselves in those emergencies over the past year. And by some estimates, that 140 million has grown to 150 million, even with some of the measures that were in place, whether it was the expanded unemployment insurance, the stimulus checks, this kind of thing. And we know, of course, that, you know, those initial reforms have not reached millions of people, whether they were undocumented, whether they were left out for other reasons, whether they were unbanked, whether they were, you know, they fell into the gaps of different provisions. The millions and millions of people have been left out. And, you know, at the same time, there are some things that have happened that indicate the possibility of, in this moment, among the multiple crises we are facing, a health crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, the opportunity to change the direction of where we go. And that won't happen because of the goodwill of politicians. That would be naive to think that. It's happening because of the kinds of organizing and mutual aid and networks that are being built, that have been being built for years leading up to this moment, that have expanded and strengthened and deepened through it, and have really been pushing for something, you know, dramatic transformation, the radical revolution of values that people have been calling for years. And some of the things that that, you know, seem to be a step forward. A lot of attention was paid to this expansion of the child tax credit from the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan. And I want to spend a minute just talking about that because it is significant and it's not enough. That's also true. But what this did was it allowed, you know, it was a step away from how welfare reform has been defined for at least a generation since the Clinton era, defined by work requirements, by all kinds of moralizing about the poor and who is deserving and who is not deserving, and really dehumanizing people who are in need of critical resources. And so what happened with this expansion of the child tax credit, it was made universal in the sense that people, you know, but before this expansion, people who didn't earn enough to pay taxes were exempt from getting the credit. If you didn't pay taxes, you couldn't take advantage of the tax credit. This was changed in this administration to include people who were too poor to pay taxes. They would almost get a form of a monthly payment, you know, several $1,000s. Now, that's not enough. And estimates of what this impact can do is to lift, you know, a certain percentage of people, 10% to 45%, depending on who you know, how you define the population, above the poverty line, above, you know, a certain measure of you know, a certain measure of basic economic need. but it's temporary. It's, it's not enough to lift people above the poverty line. And the few $100s that people get, that's not going to fundamentally change your economic position. That's not going to be able to provide families with, the kinds of homes we need, with, clean running water and air, with the healthcare we need, with the thriving communities we all deserve. And it still leaves out millions and millions of people who, cannot participate in this measure for various reasons, including especially our undocumented people and families and communities. And so, it is limited, but I want to recognize just the change that it marks, and what that means, what exists in the possibility of that change is a step away from the kind of reforms that have defined anti-poverty policy for a generation. And so if we can step into that and both say how it's limited, but to claim this victory as poor people who have been organizing in the, for this kind of thing for years, to claim it and then to push further, as others have said, that's the direction that we can and must go to expand upon this opening. And it's harder to say. The question of wages was never really addressed, right? This was kind of thrown off of the political map because of these technical, these bureaucratic, processes and things. And so that's not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it for, when tens of millions of people are finding themselves in worsening and worsening conditions. The conditions themselves are leading to an awakening that is going to demand greater attention. And what we're seeing is, at least, on the ground in the Poor People's Campaign across 45 states, is that people are seeing these gaps very clearly. They're seeing that it isn't enough to raise spending on some social welfare programs, but still leave, the vast majority of people underinsured, unable to pay for healthcare, unable to be, brought into any viable healthcare system, and otherwise just meet the needs of our families, keep healthy food on the table. And as these, so it's not enough even to raise social welfare spending when our basic needs aren't being met, even with that raise, because it's not enough. I mean, there are gaps upon gaps upon gaps of what's been done. But on the flip side of it, we also can't accept social welfare spending going up alongside military spending going up, right? These two things are not the reforms that we're looking for, right? Side by side. And we need to actually draw down the military spending. And that means more than, ending the war in Afghanistan. It means ending the war in this country, ending all the forever wars, the sanctions, everything that we're facing, and bringing these two things together in a real moral framework that responds to the needs and centers the needs of these 140 to 150 million people who have been left out for far too long. And so there is an opening. It is insufficient, but it's upon us to take advantage of that and to use the organization and capacity we've been building to step into this moment.
Thank you so much, Shally. Carlos, I know you have to leave us soon, but I'll leave this one question with you. Biden, in his speech, said that during the Obama administration that they were going to, or their aim was to address the root causes of migration, and so that immigrants would not have to leave their countries. Oftentimes, the narrative is that there aren't enough jobs in their home countries, yet we fail to dig deeper on this and ask, why aren't there jobs that cause people to have to migrate? Could you speak quite briefly on to the kind of actual root causes of migration from the countries that you've mentioned, like Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and how we connect the struggles of the poor and dispossessed here to those internationally and to the fight for immigrant and migrant rights?
Many people in United States today, as a result of all these mediatic expressions related to migration, to massive migration, and that started actually in December of 2018, when the first caravans left the border to cross through Mexico, and in an attempt to, to reach United States. So people ask, why so many refugees? But the question that barely anybody asks is, what is the cause of them, leaving their countries in such numbers? In the case of the Honduras, it's very important to remember that in July of 2009, there was a military coup. And that coup was organized from the embassy of United States in Tegucigalpa. And after the military coup, the violence against the population, and especially against peasants, human rights defenders, and anyone who attempted to question the government or to demand certain rights, were the target of the violence. Anybody who opposed, who questioned the authority that came up after the military coup, were basically trying to defend the interests of the oligarchy and imperialism, and the violence intensified after the military coup. The violence and death have not stopped since the military coup. We just have to remember the barbaric assassination of Berta Cáceres on March of 2016. But also, we must not forget that the coup of Honduras took place during the Obama administration, and that the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. And who was the vice president? Mr. Joe Biden. He was the vice president when the military coup took place. So it's very important to understand that, yes, we can push for certain things that we want to change, have to build real changes. And I agree that the issue of economic injustice have been increasing during this pandemic crisis. So what we have today is a very complicated scenario, because we would like to change. We would like to be able to push for a real social transformation of our society, to put an end to the suffering of people, to everything that people have been enduring for the past year and a half. So we firmly believe that, that is the time to put into the political agenda of all the movements, the organization of the people, to creating those forms that are gonna protect us from the system. And I really appreciate that Leonardo mentioned the issue of the autonomy, because that's a very important issue. We should be organizing to create, those structures that, the majority of the poor people have been denied today. If we don't have, if we don't have a public health system, and we are suffering as a result of the lack of a public health system, what about if we build public health system in our barrios, in our communities, in our own organizations? So I guess that today, what we think that is a very important task upon us, if we want to seek real social transformation, is that, in the current class struggle, we need to intensify our efforts to organize. In our case, the agriculture workers, the migrants, people of color, and then that these organizing efforts, no matter how big or small, because sometimes revolutionaries think that in order to change the world, you need to have a massive movement, but small efforts efforts by barrios, by communities, in workplaces, every place can push us through to that direction. The organizing efforts also need to be accompanied by a political process of formation. So the workers and their families understand what are the forces that are making our lives unbearable. And of course, we need to create other ways of organizing to protect everybody, especially during these times of these pandemic times, because something that we need to understand, and especially for us, and to be part of the many of the activities of the People Forum, we have learned from other organizations that at this moment in history, it's impossible to return to our organizing ways of the past. We need to start creating new organizing ways, and we need to organize by raising the level of consciousness of the workers, in our case, the farm workers, in order to, to point to the building of a different kind of society, control from the communities and from the peoples that are now being, most affected by this crisis created by the economic system that we have upon us. And I really thank you. Unfortunately, I have to go, but I'll be glad to, to answer any questions by email.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate. Good to see Shelly. Good to see Leonardo. Good to see David, of course, and Rita in the backstage. And we'll be in touch. And our commitment is to work together with you and with other organizations that are really thinking as a strategy, at the end of the day, a real social transformation. I think.
Carlos.
Thank you so much, Carlos.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes. Leo, I'm gonna go back to you actually. I believe a recent statistic showed that 1 in 7 renters are behind on rent. Have you already seen a move to evict tenants? I think you already mentioned that you all have been organizing eviction defenses, but also regarding the houseless, those who live in tent cities, have those evictions happen? And what does the fight ahead look like for those who are fighting for housing and housing justice and shelter in LA, but also nationwide?
No, the fight is very, very tough, and it's going to require a lot of organizing and a lot of hope. I mean, really, certainly, and really, we believe that our organizations and the organizations of the poor are the centers of hope. And whenever we talk in public and in the community, we remind them, you will not be able to fight this fight alone. It's very, very important for people to come together. So when it comes to the evictions, it's as I said, yes, it's been an ongoing process, and it's been a very hostile environment for tenants. There is a lot of pressure on tenants to move out. There is economic pressure, there is social pressure, there is racist pressure. I mean, people are being offered money to move out without realizing that that money is going to last long enough for them to stay in a home. They're being attacked under all sorts of form of racist attacks, and they have to resist. The police and the law enforcement agencies are lending themselves to this harassment. And then there is the inadequacy of a lot of the organizations. I mean, the legal services organizations, as much as they are our friends and they have always helped us, but they're in a situation where they can only help you when you are in court fighting your own eviction, which in a lot of the cases is very late. You're only, as I said before, you're negotiating your defeat, you're negotiating on what terms you're going to be moving out of your building. So there is not enough legal services to be able to provide this help. And so tenants have to fight to stay in their homes. Tenants will have to fight to protect those places, and the organization is going to have to be there to protect those homes. And it's going to be a tough fight because not everybody is going to be ready to do it, and a lot of people are going to be afraid. But the organization is the one that has to push this thing forward. The organization has to build that with the people who are ready to fight. And we see an example, actually, very surprising examples amongst the homeless. The homeless community has developed a lot of strategies. So we have the situation here on Echo Park recently where the homeless community established themselves in a park, in Echo Park, and they built the community that they needed to build. They built their own security. They built their own, they planted their own plants that were growing their own food inside this park. They built their own bathrooms and showers and kitchens. And they created a space that was safe for them, that would provide them as a stable community, and also a place where they were able to help each other and assist each other in finding jobs and getting support. And in some cases, because unfortunately, sometimes we find the situation where people have drug problems, when they were also giving support to each other. Many lives were saved in the middle of this process. Yet the city, who is not able to provide that safety, who is not able to provide that housing, who is not able to provide those resources, decided that it was time to kick them out. And they used massive police forces, about 400 policemen for less than 100 homeless people who lived in this park. And the community came to support and to protect them. And unfortunately, they were pushed out, but they gave us an example of what is possible. And the community response gave us an example of what solidarity looks like. And the state itself, in turn, showed us how enabled they are to do this, and also their goals. The people have been moved out of this park, have ended up in hotels, and what we call carcelary housing. Basically, they can only stay in their hotel in their room, and they can only the only way they can be in the room is if they're in their own room, locked up, ready to sleep, or just living. So they cannot be in any public area. They cannot get together. They cannot talk to each other. So either you're in the hotel in your room, or you're outside somewhere else. But you cannot be able to do. There's no freedom of association. There is no freedom of speech. There is nothing inside those buildings that the city is calling housing. So we need to understand that the solutions of the state are carcelary solutions right now and expulsion. And when we look at this battle, we're going to have to think in those terms. The solutions are the jail or a carcelary system or major expulsions. On the evictions, people are being pushed to move outside of the city because the city is rejecting the poor. So the fight becomes very, very, very tough. But meanwhile, and this goes to the reform and the promises that the city or that actually the state is offering, there is the notion of affordable housing. And I think it's very important in our fight to kill affordable housing as a concept. Affordable housing is the way, is the funnel through which people are being pushed out of the city, pushed out of the neighborhood. I'll give you an example. In San Diego, the city eliminated all public housing. There is no public housing in San Diego. That public housing was given in turn to affordable housing developers, but the affordable housing developers could not house the most poor that were pushed out of this public housing. Now these affordable housing developers cannot keep with the market, and they have to sell the properties that they own, and they're selling them to private speculators, to Blackstone, who's buying real estate all across the country, and they're selling it to private developers that supposedly are going to provide affordable housing. And the way to kill affordable housing is to ask them, affordable to whom? In most communities, this so-called affordable housing is not affordable to the people who need it the most. So the city, when they talk about we're going to house the homeless, they say we're going to build affordable housing. And that means we're going to give money to for-profit private corporations to build housing that is not affordable. It's not affordable to the tenants that cannot pay rent, and it's not affordable to the homeless. So I go back to the homeless community. We need to organize ourselves. We need to organize our spaces of struggle, and we need to organize our spaces of defense, and we're going to organize our own solutions to the problem. So we still don't know what shape it's going to take, but we see the seeds of that struggle in our communities. And no, we don't think that our current president, no matter how much desire he has to help, will be able to provide those solutions, especially if he, with his billions of dollars, is suffering that there's going to be more affordable housing. I could go on this one because it's really, really going to be a tough one. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Leo. You could feel kind of how much you worked on this and how important of an issue it is. And I think this is a good segue to the kind of last question I wanted to ask, is that when we see the poor start to organize, there's always a pushback from the ruling class. Could you share what this looks like, Shelly, in terms of voter suppression and increased military spending?
Yes, and in fact, one of the ways that it's pushed back is by trying to divide the various needs of the poor into these separate pieces, right? And so you can have affordable, quote unquote, affordable housing, but not have the wages to actually afford that housing. And the wages are kept out of the political discussion because of some, anachronistic procedural, thing that has no that actually is going to hurt millions and millions of people. And then on top of that, you have this poverty line that underestimates the amount of poverty in the country, and therefore all the programs are underfunded, and there's this imposed false scarcity, that everyone's scrambling around to receive a cut of these programs, when in fact there's great abundance. And we can see that when not only we compare it to military spending, but the kind of taxation that has been implemented that gives trillions of dollars over to wealthy individuals, over to corporations, that allows for wealth to be hoarded in that way, even during this pandemic. If you look at a map or a graph of billionaire wealth over the past 20 some years, a third of their wealth has gone up by a third in the last 13 months during this pandemic. Their wealth has gone up by a third of of the total. And so there's something deeply wrong when that's the kind of situation, and it all contributes to then, being able to divide and manipulate and keep people fighting for scraps. But the two things that you in particular asked about, I mean, it is very concerning that even before 2020, more than 24 states had passed voter suppression laws, that restricted who had access to participate in elections in many ways. But since in 2021, in this legislative season, over 360 laws have been introduced in 47 states. This is not limited to one part of the country. So virtually every part of the country, these are laws that are intended deliberately to restrict participation in elections, and the targets are explicitly, poor, Black, Latino, Native voters, right? And so, there have also been dozens of anti-protest bills passed in or introduced in dozens of states. So, the ability to engage in the political process is being steadily constrained. Not only can you not engage through elections, but then the space where you may contest your inability to participate is also being constrained, right? Between the voter suppression laws on the one hand and the anti-protest laws on the other. And when this happens, obviously there are multiple ways to participate in the political process. We have to redefine what that means, and we are, through the kinds of movements and organizing and organizations that we're building. But in effect, what it also requires is the kind of, cross these alliances that Carlos was speaking to, of us coming together, and to see that wherever we are, these attacks on any segment, any sector of the 140, 150, 200 million people in this country or around the world is an attack on us all. And to approach that in that, united way, because otherwise it is too easy to be satisfied excuse me, it's too easy to be satisfied with these incremental, gains. It's too easy to fall into that way of thinking unless we surround ourselves with the kinds of organizations, the kind of conscious leadership that says, no, we can never be satisfied until everybody is in and everybody has all of our needs taken care of.
Thank you so much, Shelly. Is there, and just on the second part, has the military spending in terms of the military budget, has that increased? We know that during the speech that Biden gave in front of Congress, one of the kind of lines that really stuck out to media was that the US is in a competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. And he specifically pointed out to the Department of Defense and the work that the budgets that they've had to work with that he claims then kind of leads to other kind of innovations. So what is happening kind of with that international budget? The budget for the military, and how is that leading to kind of the oppression and problems that we're facing?
There are, sorry. there are a couple different ways to look at it, but so on the one hand, we're seeing this increase in social welfare spending compared to military spending, how the increases are not the same. And in fact, in terms of federal discretionary spending, I think for the first time in a long time, the increases in social welfare spending are greater than the military spending, but dollar for dollar, there's an increase in military spending. The military budget that's being proposed is greater, even though the war in Afghanistan is going to be ended. That that's not a commitment. That's not the kind of commitment that we can accept. Not only because we cannot. Everyone here knows we cannot end the injustices we face. Without actually ending militarism, without actually ending war. Against peoples all around the world. That there's no way that we can end then the injustices we face in this country. This relationship of foreign policy to domestic policy is deep, and it's a false. There's a false. It's a myth to think that these can be separated out and you can raise both and therefore everyone is happy. No, that is not true. And that's not the world that, that Carlos is calling us to imagine and build. And it's not the world that any of us needs. It's not the world that, the communities that we live in and organize in and fight for are demanding at all.
Thank you so much, Shelley. So folks that are on Zoom and also on YouTube, feel free to use the Q&A and the live chat to ask any questions. Carlos did have to jump off, but we are still joined by Leo and Shelley. So we do have one question from YouTube. Fu said, my question, seeing as trade associations write to the legislation in the US, wouldn't disrupting or countering lobbyists be the smartest strategy of fighting oligarchy in the US? Who wants to take that on?
That sounds like a Shelley question.
I mean, I think that, we have seen in the history of this country and the history of other countries and the current experience that, when people who are most impacted by the injustices of any kind of society come together across their differences and build a real social movement, that's the kind of, it exerts a political power, an economic power, and a moral authority that is in fact greater than what I would, than countering any taking on any specific sector of what is the ruling class today, right? So, our power is in our numbers. And, in the United States, at least, where if there are 3 men who own as much wealth as half the country, that's still half the country that owns, that has access to as much wealth or resources and, as those 3 men. Our power is in the 140, 150 million people in this country to push for and demand something else through the political authority, through the moral authority that comes from actually coming together. And, I find great inspiration from the fusion organizing, that comes out of the Southern, the history of the South of this country, where after the Civil War and the Reconstruction era, where freed slaves and poor whites were coming together over deep and violent histories, right? Coming together towards a common interest that is still in some state-based constitutions in the South. If you look at the Constitution of North Carolina, it talks about a right to education and the right to the fruits of your own labor that was implemented and put in motion out of the Reconstruction era, where this fusion of people who were deliberately divided was, the fusion pushed back against that history and created something new and transformational. It didn't last, but it didn't last because it was attacked, because of how powerful it was. And so I think there's a deep power that has to come from, from the kind of alliances we can build today. Alliances built on, not out of, alliances built on, a solidarity that recognizes that unless poor and dispossessed people are, leading this effort and centered in everything that we're doing, then nobody's needs will be met. We've seen this in the course of this pandemic. This is not a question of pity. It is not a question of charity. It's a question of our common survival. And that's a kind of deep solidarity that we need right now that will, in fact, be more powerful, I think, than trying to target a specific, that's the power we can build. That's the power we can, we need to build today. And I know Leo can speak more to that.
Yeah, no, but also the other thing, I think we need to also recalibrate and the way we look at the struggle. I think there's many places where this fight has to happen. So yes, we must disrupt the lobbyists with that process, but we also need to change how the Constitution is being read. We need to eliminate the Electoral College. We need to do lots of things across these different places. And that kind of fusion requires that kind of ability to see the whole. I think one of the problems that we've had over the years is that when we ask these questions about like the first 100 days of the president or something like that, is that we're looking for that moment of peace when we can relax. And then we just sit down on that long strategy and that victory that we had. And then everything turns around against us. And these are not the kind of times that we need. We need to learn also from our opposition. I mean, the right has never given up on their fight. And we need to take the same kind of position. We have to fight, and never take a sense of breathing room. I know people are tired from the struggle against Trump, but we haven't come out. We're not out to breathe there yet. We need to keep pushing forward. So I agree. I would dare to say that's one tactic in the long-term strategy, but it's not the strategy. It's not the solution to the whole. So we need to have a broader picture and look at the different places of struggle and push, never give up, because every time that we slow down, and I'm sorry to say, but I think we slowed down when Obama got elected because we felt that we were in a very magical, special place, and nothing happened. He became the deporter-in-chief and the drone murderer-in-chief, and lots of things happened under his presidency because we stopped pushing. So we need to keep pushing, and we need to look at the different tactics and spaces of the struggle, but also be clear on the vision. And I think Charlie talked about that vision very clearly.
Great. I think that's actually a great place to wrap up. Do either of you have any things to close us off? Any closing statements that you want to make?
Just one quick thing on some of the aid that Charlie was talking about. It's about $45 billion that are going to be given on renters aid. And just to give you a picture of what's happening in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles took this rent. They only gave a month of people to apply for it. Within that month, and also they segmented who was going to give the aid first. So this is a form that creates more competition and more division amongst the people that are going to receive the aid. But also it splits the field, right? So some people are going to be celebrating and happy that they got this aid. The government is going to come out and say, oh, we helped some people. And then there's going to be all this other sector that has been excluded. The same is happening across the county on different levels. So the aid itself is serving more or less a magic wand to hide the real problem and to pacify some of the situation. And also is operating in a way that is dividing more of the community. So we also have to be very careful, going back to this notion of charity and pity, that we're not looking at celebrating charity when we should be fighting for justice. All this aid is not enough. It divides people. I want to start looking at how we're going to change the conditions so people are not in debt and people are able to live in their homes and stay there permanently. But this applies to every single sector where aid, quote unquote, is being given.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that even in these discussions around the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, Senator Manchin out of West Virginia was saying, well, we don't need that here. We're fine with 11. And how is that even possible? And it's possible in part because some of how we define and understand the need is so limited. So when we're talking about housing and the right to housing and homelessness, most of these policies are based on a count that is woefully low, right? We're talking about 500, 600,000 people who are homeless on every night versus, actually 8 to 10 million people who are at risk of homelessness before the pandemic, right? And now even more so. And then the housing debt that is accumulated through this time, the rent that is accumulated through this time. I mean, we're looking at tens of millions of people who are in this moment. You know, a few $1 billion is not going to cut it. And so I think just recognizing the scale and scope of this problem, and you know, it to me, it also speaks to the difference between you know, organizations that are built and infrastructure that is built around and with poor and dispossessed people at their center, right? I mean, it's easy to kind of appease an individual person. It's harder to appease an organized group of people. And so the demands will be different, you know, the push will be different and more sustained. And that's where I think the building and work that has gone into, you know, whether it's the decades of work coming out of Unión de Vecinos around the border or elsewhere. I mean, this is the time to learn the lessons and apply what we've learned and expand our organizing, and to really offer opportunities, offer these, you know, these poles that can attract people who will suddenly find themselves in positions that they never thought they would be in. And to show that there is a place where we can build power, you know, together. And that's the kind of power that we need to be building, not the kind of power that can be taken away from us in a stimulus check.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ali and Leo. It's been really just an amazing evening to have this conversation with you. As we wrap up, there are 2 asks that we want to make to the folks that are on Zoom and on YouTube. One is that we are leading a campaign along with Code Pink for syringes for Cuba. The Cuban people and its doctors have given so much internationally, and it is our time to help them. They have developed vaccines, but they are lacking in syringes to administer those vaccines because of the blockades. And so by donating, you are supporting both the Cuban effort, but also to denouncing the blockade on the Cuban people. The second ask is that we will be having an event tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time as we near the 73rd year of the Nakba, and with the current events of what is happening in Palestine. Join us in a conversation and discussion around the current context of the US-backed Zionist occupation of Palestine and imperialist interventions in the region. We've dropped the links, both the links in the chat. We'll be posting it also on the YouTube chat. So we ask that everyone help us in these campaigns and in this conversation so that we can continue to build international solidarity. So I want to thank once again both Shali and Leo for joining us, and also Rita, who is behind the scenes. We couldn't do any of this work without the work of folks that are just doing the behind the scenes work. So thank you so much, Rita.